Hello all, welcome to another session on Java programming. In this class, we'll be taking a look at the use of this interface HTTP session. The interface HTTP session is useful for creating sessions in Java. So what is a session? An user accesses many web pages when he is interacting with a web application. A session helps us to track the activity of an user and also to share the information about an user across many page requests. So that is the use of a session. And HTTP session interface helps us to create a session for the user and store information about the user and also to identify an user across more than one page request. A session usually corresponds to one user who may visit a site many times. So let's understand the entire concept of sessions using a very simple example. I've created a visualization here for you to understand. Let's say an user by name Satish, let me put my name here. He is trying to interact with a web application. So first he's going to get this HTML page login.html and he will be entering his username here. He enters his username as Satish and password as ABC. He enters username as Satish and password as ABC. And this is the submit button. He clicks on the submit button. When he clicks on the submit button, an HTTP request object is getting generated. So an HTTP request object is getting generated. The method we are going to use here is the post method. Since we are sending some username and password, we are sending some data to the server. So we'll use the post method. And the username Satish will be passed out part of the request and password ABC will also be part of the request object. In addition to this, we have an URL mapped to the request, say that is /login. A request object is now getting sent to the server. So we have our Tomcat server. So this request object comes to the server and the server knows that this /login is mapped to this servlet by name login check servlet. So the request will be diverted to this servlet and this servlet is going to respond and it's going to check the username and password. If it's a valid user, it will create a session. So it will create an object of session and then a unique session ID will be created for this user. So this is auto generated. And from the login servlet, say we are getting the Satish, which is the username, which is coming as part of the request. We can move that to a session. So we can move data from a servlet to a session, and this will be maintained here. And once when the session is created, when the user is validated, what this login servlet is going to do is it's going to send a response back. The response is nothing but an hyperlink as I have shown here. So this is an HTTP response that's coming back and that's just an hyperlink. When the user clicks on this hyperlink, again another request object gets sent. So now the user is clicking on an hyperlink. He's just requesting a resource. So the request object here is going to be going ahead with a get method. So we are going to use a get method for as part of this request and the URL pattern say is checking his class timing. So say class timings is the URL pattern and the web container knows that for this particular URL pattern, the servlet that should be invoked is class timing servlet. Now class timing servlet can post the class timings back to the user as a response, but then it wants to say show a message like welcome username. So from where it can get the username, it can access the username from the session that is already created. So this session, how it is going to know that this user is mapped to the session? There is a concept behind it. Say when this login servlet is responding, it will respond with the session ID to the client. Whenever this client makes a request again, you should send the request with the session ID. So you're going to have 112 coming here. So this servlet is going to get the session ID. Using the session ID, it can get the username and it can write a response back now to the client. So as part of this response, what is going to be the response? You can see, welcome Satish. Last time. See how this username was accessed by this servlet. It was using the session ID that was sent back by the client, and then it was able to access the username. So this is how a session can be created, and this session will have a unique ID, and multiple servlets can access the data from the session, and then it can respond to the client. I hope you are clear with this. We'll directly now move on to the code. So as part of our code, we'll be creating login HTML. We'll create a login servlet. We'll move our data to the session by creating a session inside the login servlet. And then we'll also create the class timing servlet. We'll access the data of the session in the class timing servlet and respond to the client. So this is the code we are going to write. Let's take a look at it. Okay, now let's look at the demo. Let us first create this project. Let's create a dynamic web project. We'll call this project name as session management, and click on next, next, generate web.xml, finish. Let's add an HTML page to our session management project. So right click, go to new, and then add an HTML file. So here we'll give the name as login.html. Click next and then finish. Okay, now let's complete this login.html page. We'll say login page to be the title, and we'll create this very simple form here. This form is going to accept an username and password. We'll have a label. We'll say enter your username, and we'll get the username through a text box. So input type is equal to text, and we'll give a name property for this. The name property is username, and we'll say this is required. Next we'll have a break tag. Now we'll get the password. Input type is equal to password. Name property for this is password. This is also required, and then we'll have a break tag here too. So we should have a label for a password too. So label, we'll have a label here. That is enter your password. Next, we are going to have this submit button. Input type is equal to submit, and we'll give a name property for submit, that is submit, and value, we'll give value is submit. We have completed a simple form. The next thing is what will happen when the user clicks on the submit. There should be a resource requested corresponding to an URL. So we'll give the action as login check. So this will be the URL that will be requested /login check, and the servlet by name login check will be requested from the server when the user clicks on submit. And the method we are going to use here is the post method, because we are sending some data to the server like username and password. So we will use the post method. I hope you are able to follow this simple login form. We have created a form which accepts username and password. When the user clicks on submit, a resource from the server is requested corresponding to the URL /login check, and the method we are using here is the post method. Let's run this HTML form. How will you run this? Right click on the page, run as, run on server. So this is going to put the changes to the server and start a server. Yeah, restart server. So you can see the changes are being pushed onto the server. We'll be able to see the page now, the .html page. Okay, our .html page is ready. So what next? When the user clicks on submit, what will happen? /login check, this URL will be mapped to a login check servlet, and then that servlet will be validating the username and password. Let's add this servlet. So we'll go to the project, right click, new, and then you go to a servlet. So we'll give this a name for this as login check, and next, next, So we'll select some methods: init, destroy, service, do get, do post, standard methods, and then we'll finish. So our servlet code is ready. So from the service method, we'll be diverting to do post, since our request is handled in the post method inside the servlet. So just diverting it to the do post, and inside do post, we're going to handle the request. So all our code is going to be here. Now what login check does is it'll get the username and password, and then it's going to validate the user. If he's a valid user, it will create a session, move the username to the session, and then we'll also be sending a response back. That will be an hyperlink. So we have discussed already this in the first part of the session, right? We're coding that. So what we'll do here is we'll first set the response, response dot set content type. That will be HTML text slash HTML. So this is what will be the content of a response. And we'll also be using a print writer object here to write the response back to the client. So let's use print writer out is equal to response dot get writer. So we created an object of type print writer here. The next thing is as part of the request object, whatever that is coming in is the username and password is coming in. So we'll gather those details from the request object here. String username is equal to, so it's a request dot get parameter, and then whatever name property we have given in the HTML username, and the string password local variable we are creating. It's again from the request object we'll get the data request dot get parameter, and whatever name property we have given there, that is password. So whatever value the user enters through the form is received in username and password through the request object. What next? We have to validate the username and password. How will you validate that? If I'm just using a blend validation here, if the username dot equals say if the username equals Satish, and password dot equals say ABC. We are just having a simple validation here, and then this user is a valid user. Else we are going to write some data to the client, that is out.print. We can say you are an invalid user. So this username and password is not correct. If he is a valid user, what we are going to do is we are going to create a session. For this, we'll be using the HTTP session interface. We'll create an object of type HTTP session, that is request.getSession. So we are creating a session here. The session is created. The next thing is we are going to move this username to our session. So how to move a value to the session? For that, you have to use the session object dot set attribute. And say I'm going to call this as name in the session. And what value I'm going to move to the session is the username. So what I am performing here is I have created the session, and I'm using the session object dot set attribute to move whatever username I'm getting in. I'm calling that as name field in the session. So the session is created. The next thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to send an hyperlink back to the user. So I'll use out.print and a message like welcome doctor. And now I'm going to get the data that I have set in the session, and I'm going to access it here. How can I access it there? It's like session name dot get attribute, and then you pass the name that you have given here. So what is that? I have set this, the name is name, so I will be getting whatever username I have passed here. And next thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to send an hyperlink back to the user. So let's send an hyperlink back to the user. So how will you create this hyperlink? It's a href, and this will be mapped to this class timings servlet. And let's close this hyperlink. So click here to know your class timings, and then let's close the hyperlink. Yes, close the quotes. It's done. So this is the message that will be sent back. So it is welcome doctor. So I'm getting the username from the session, And what is that we're getting here? That is the name property. So let's give that in quotes. Plus an hyperlink is sent. When he clicks on the hyperlink, the requested URL is slash class timings. It will divert us to another servlet called class timings, and that will display the class timings for the user. So click here to know your class timings. So we're done with our code. There's one small mistake here. It's a single quotes that I have to use. So our code is ready. Let's run this and check whether it's going to work fine. But there's one small thing we have to do. We have to code our web.xml. So for that, we have to go to web.xml. And then what we need to do here is we need to code our web.xml file. We all know that web.xml is used for mapping the URL pattern with the servlet class. So let's finish this servlet. So we have to first give a name for a servlet name. So I'll give it as login check. And what is the class name for the servlet? Servlet class. The class we have coded is login check. And after this, we have to go with the servlet mapping. This is where we will be mentioning the URL pattern for the servlet we have created. So servlet name. What is the servlet name? That is login check. And the URL mapping, URL pattern, nothing but slash login check. So we have done with our changes to the web.xml file. What we'll do is we'll run this login.html. Let's check whether our code is really working. So run as run on server. So run as run on server. Let's push the changes to the server. Execute it, restart the server. So what's going to happen when the user submits the username and password? If it's a valid user, we'll create the session, move the username to the session, and then we'll also send an hyperlink back to the user. If he's an invalid user, we are going to say you are an invalid user. So let me enter a valid user, Satish and ABC, the password, and I click on submit. We have received the output here. So welcome message Dr. Satish. So this Satish was the name that we have moved on to the session using the set attribute, and we have received that name using .get attribute, session object .get attribute, and we are displaying it here. So we are using a session here, and then we are displaying this hyperlink. When the user clicks on this hyperlink, he will be diverted to another servlet. So we need to create another servlet for displaying his class timings. Let's go to new, let's add a servlet. And let's give the name for this servlet as check class timings. And next, we'll have some methods in it: destroy, service, do post, do get method, and then finish. So servlet is ready. So when whatever request that comes to the service method, we'll divert it to the do post here. Let's forward the request to do post. We'll handle the entire thing inside the do post method. So inside the do post method, what we're going to do is we're just going to send a message back to the user. So we are going to have this response set. So we're going to write the code here. So first we'll set this response content type, response dot set content type. So the content we are going to send is text/html. And we need an object of type print writer. Print writer out is equal to response dot get writer. So this is the response writer. Now we can write this message out.print your class timings are say from 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. something like that, 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. So this is the message that is being sent to the client. But then if you want to display the name of that user here, say you want to display the username here, so what we are going to do is we are going to make use of the session. We have already created the session. We have moved the username there. So we should access that session here. So how to access that session? We use the HTTP session object here. So HTTP session, the session name that we are given as user is equal to request.getSession. So this is going to fetch us the session that we have already created, and how you can access the name property that we have loaded in the session. We can give welcome doctor, and then here we are going to use the session object user dot get attribute. So we are going to retrieve the value from the session, and what is that value we have loaded on? That is the name value. So we are going to get the name value from the session, and we'll concatenate that with our string. So this is how we can use the session across different servlets. So now this username for the user is shared across different servlet. One of the servlet is check class timings, another servlet is login check. So we can create as many servlets we want. If we want to get the data of the user, what we can do is we can access the session, we can get the attributes pertaining to the user using the property. Say I have loaded the name, so I am able to get the name. Like that, you can load any kind of properties you want for the user. So let's check whether this code works. But before that, we have to change our web.xml. What is that we are going to do here in web.xml? We are going to have this mapping, that is um, say the servlet name I'm going to give here is check class timings. And what is the servlet class we have written? That is also check class timings. And the servlet name here is check class timings. So we have to map the URL pattern. And what is the URL pattern we are going to give here? Check class timings. So this URL pattern should be actually in your HTML code, right? The HTML code is login check, and the year, this is the URL pattern. So it's check class timings. So slash check class timings. Slash check class timings is actually mapped to the servlet check class timings. That's what is given in the web.xml. Slash check class timings URL is mapped to the check class timings servlet. Okay, now our code is ready, and we need to check whether this one works. Let's run our login.html, run as run on server. So this is going to restart the server, changes to server. So next finish, restart the server. Okay, the server is started. Let's give a valid user, Satish and ABC. Now you can see the data getting loaded and displayed from the server. Now when I click on this slash class timings, so when I click on this, slash check class timings will be requested from the server, and that will be diverted to check class timings servlet. So you can see here, welcome again. This Dr. Satish, I have received that from the session. So user.get attribute. So we use that session we have created. We are able to access the data across different servlets. That is the main objective behind this session. We're able to use a session and access the data of an user across different servlets. And there is also session ID associated with this session that will be shared with the client, and the client will be requesting using the session ID. So we have done with our code. There are many other methods with respect to a session. For instance, say here, I'm just trying to display the use of certain methods. I can use user dot get creation time for the session. When this session was created, that we can display. And maybe I'll just display that using an out dot print. We'll display everything on the client. So that is user dot get creation time for the session. And you can also have this print. You can also get the session ID, user.get ID. The session ID, I told you, right? Every time a session is created, a unique ID is generated and shared with the client. Every time the client makes a request, the ID is generated. We'll be able to see that ID. You also have other methods like print user, that is the session dot last access time, get last access time. So when the client really accessed the server, what was the last time the client accessed the server with respect to this session? And we have this out dot print user dot get max active interval. So normally this active interval is 30 minutes. If there is no response from the client within 30 minutes, the session is invalidated. So you can also invalidate a session using this method, that is you can just call session object dot invalidated. So if there is no response from the user for a certain amount of time, you can invalidate the session. When the user logs out, you can invalidate the session using user dot invalidate. For now, I'll comment this because we're not invalidating the session. We'll see what is this. What are the outputs that we are going to get? They're going to get session dot get creation time. This time will be in milliseconds, and last access time will also be in milliseconds, and everything, the interval also will be in milliseconds. We'll be able to see the ID. Maybe we can give some messages here. The creation time is, and can give the user the session ID is. Okay, so that we can do, and the last access time. So this will be in milliseconds. The session last accessed time. So this will be in milliseconds, and the max active interval. The max active interval, you can see. Okay, we have finished coding this method. Let us run this application and check. So it's going to be run as run on server, and then next, finish. So it's just going to display the use of these methods. Let me enter a valid user, Satish and ABC. And when I click on submit, you can see the creation time in milliseconds, the session ID, and then the session last access time in milliseconds, and the max active interval is displayed along with the message. So when he clicks on this message, the servlet check last timings will respond, get the data from the session, and then displays the timings. Okay, that's it. I hope you all have understood the concepts on sessions, how to create session and use the various methods of sessions. Thank you.